Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week I have not one but two very special guests. I have Mike Tuñez from Firelog Games and Benerson Little, his historical consultant and pirates expert extraordinaire. How are y'all gentlemen doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, Liz. How about you?
I'm doing all right. How about you, Benerson?
I'm fine. It's Sunday morning, and I've had 2 cups of coffee.
You know what? It's a great start. Let's start with you, Mike. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So, my name is Mike, Mike Tuñez, as you pointed out, and I am the studio director here at Firelock Games, and we make historical miniatures games as well as, well, not just limited to historical, but for now, mostly historical miniatures games. And I'm a very avid war gamer and very interested in history and anything else that's interesting.
And you, Benerson?
I'm the author of several books on piracy, Firelock's historical consultant. I've also done a lot of historical consulting for Hollywood, other places. I was Black Sails historical consultant for all 4 seasons. And basically, I've just kind of by accident got locked into studying piracy, past, present, possibly future.
All right, so you two have come together to make something amazing in the form of Blood and Plunder, which is a miniatures game about piracy. So, can we get a rundown of that?
Of the game itself, or how we came to?
Yeah. I don't play minis. I'm a solo board gamer. Tell us everything.
Cool. Well, so Blood and Plunder is sort of just a passion project for me, right? Like I have always been very interested in. So one of my big hobbies is sailing. I live in Miami, Florida. I spend a lot of time in the Keys and around the ocean, and I am of Spanish, Cuban heritage, and so the whole Caribbean colonization thing is very interesting to me from a historical perspective. So the whole setting and thing has always been just super interesting to me. I've always wanted to learn more about it. I played a miniatures game for a while that ended up going defunct, and after that went defunct, there was no other thing like it. So I decided to try my hand at making my own game so Blood and Plunder was my first attempt at making a rule set of my own. Ended up getting together with a business partner named Alex Aguilar, who thought the game was really good when he played it. And then we started a company in Firelock Games. Here we are. So Blood and Plunder it's a 20 millimeter scale, which is, for those not familiar with miniature wargaming scales, it's roughly a 156 scale. And it's made to play out small scale raids and actions in the 17th and now 18th centuries. It's got some pretty unique mechanics on how units are activated, how initiative is determined, and some of those important things that are often left to chance get a little more control over. We try to make it as realistic and as historically accurate as possible, while not pretending to be a simulation at the same time. So it's a game first, but it is heavily steeped in the reality and the history and the same sort of tactics and things you'd find commanders using in this time period. These types of battles will be effective and be rewarded in the game. Is that a good description?
Yeah, it sounds good to me. So I'm speaking from a place of ignorance, and I wanted to have y'all on because when I think of a miniatures game, and this is again because I don't really play them. I think of move pirate on map, roll, see if you hit somebody with a cannon. That's it. So this sounds like it's something that's much more in depth and much more historically thought out. So what aspects of this game has Benerson been able to help you with? What kind of in-depth mechanisms are we talking about here?
I should go back into a little bit of the history, and I should say one thing I left out on the last thing is one very unique feature of Blood and Plunder is that it's the only miniatures game I'm aware of that's truly amphibious, at least infant miniatures game. So where you could play with full scale ships, and you could play on land, or you could play anywhere in between. So basically the whole game is streamlined and integrated into one rule set. It's not like two separate games that kind of work together. It's all the same thing. But to go back to your question, where Benerson has really helped us, and I'll let him interject here a little bit too, is he was the kind of the original inspiration for the direction Blood and Plunder took before we even met each other. So I had come across his book. So while I'm writing this rule set, I'm looking around all over the place for information, trying to get some historical information on pirates, and it's actually really hard to do from a wargaming perspective because you typically get lots of information about their lifestyle, how they became pirates, the general high level ramifications of that on a global scale, if you will, and that sort of thing, right? And then you get some customs, some things like that, but you don't really get like the tactics, how they fought, their motivations, a lot of these things that come down to some more the nitty gritty historical detail for the actual combat. So that's where this Benerson's book, The Sea Rover's Practice, came into play. So I came across that book, and it was just a wellspring of all that information. It was just like everything I could ever ask for in one place. So that became like the go-to for everything from there on. It actually changed the game initially. So then, and that was when I was kind of just doing this as a for fun project before it became a business. So once we started working on Firelock Games and trying to put Blood and Plunder out in a bigger way, at that point we were able to we just reached out to Benerson, who was thankfully very welcoming and friendly to people who reach out to him. And maybe I shouldn't say that on the podcast. You can edit that out. But so we reached out to him, and he was able to provide us with even more detailed information. So some of those things that I had touched on, wherever I had questions, the way the units looked, the way they fought, I would come up with an idea of the way certain things would work together if these guys could fight together in the same unit, that kind of thing, and just able to bounce those things off of him because he just knows the answers. I could find the answer probably with a few months of research, or I could just ask Benerson and know in 5 minutes, which is super helpful when you're designing a game because it's basically historical research project and game design. It's almost like two separate things potentially if you really want to get it right, which we do. So having a historical consultant is just super beneficial in that aspect.
Benerson, had you been an avid gamer before, or did you get into this just for the pirates?
I got into this primarily for the pirates at first, but very quickly really got interested in a whole lot of other things associated with the game. When I was a kid, and even when I have a couple of adult daughters now, and they were little, we played board games, your typical board games all the time. And when Mike and Alex were actually first talking to me, had almost forgotten that I'd played an old game called Broadsides and Bordering Parties, I think it was called, or Broadsides and Borders, and things like this. But I really was not familiar with wargaming. But several things immediately drew me to it. One was Mike, who already knew a lot about piracy, but he had this emphasis on making a fun game, but putting as much legitimate history in there, particularly on the tactical end, but also on the cultural end. The game is most pirate games you see on the market. They're pirates versus English Navy, which is actually a flawed concept to begin with. It's a popular concept, but in reality, pirates pretty much lost every time they went up against the Royal Navy. I mean, almost every single time they either ran or they were just trashed. But Blood and Plunder has all sorts of factions. It's basically taking even sub factions. It's not the correct term, but it has Native Americans who are allied with the Spanish, basically, as that can be used as defenders. You've got Black Caribs. You can basically play almost anything you want in the Caribbean, which is very refreshing because most books and games on piracy don't really emphasize this multicultural aspect. I mean, in fact, the Spanish Caribbean was probably 75-80% people of color at the time. And so that's the second thing that I really, really liked about this game. The third was, and we're really going to date myself here, but when I was a kid, I liked playing with toy soldiers all the time. And I even remember an episode of the old TV show Daniel Boone when I think his kid was called Israel. I'm not sure. But he got this big box and it opened it up and it was just all these cannon and soldiers and stuff. And I thought that was one of the coolest things in the world. So when Mike graciously, when the game first came out, sent me actually a big box filled with all these game ships and toys, it was like flashback decades, to this TV image to, oh my God, I'm a kid again. And this is so cool. And I can, build all these ships and buildings and paint these people in the 20 years it's going to take me. I'm actually my 4-year-old. I'm gonna hire him in a couple of years when he's to start paying all this stuff for me. But anyway, those were three things I really liked about the game: the historical research and detail that went into it, the cross cultural aspect of the game, which really gets away from the Spanish evil, white Buccaneers good kind of thing, and then just the fact that I've got all these wonderful toy soldiers that I'm really interested in, on a giant table that I can sit out and play with my kids.
I mean, that is legit. So here's my question. What tactically do you need to take into consideration when you're doing a pirate battle in this game? What kinds of research was necessary to create an authentic feeling pirate skirmish?
That would be a question more for Benerson maybe, because my research was asking him. So,
well, I was really going to pass this question back to Mike because he's the game designer and he's a brilliant game designer, by the way. I'm not kissing up to him. Mike knows I'm not if I'm praising somebody, it's legitimate. Um, so, so there's probably a better question in some ways for Mike to answer. The book he mentioned I'd written, Sea Rover's Practice, was not a book I ever planned on writing. I was actually doing a lot of research. I was interested in the subject. I'd been a naval officer and a Navy SEAL, and since I was a kid reading Treasure Island at about 10 years old, it was an annotated copy, and I'd been fascinated by tactics and just how pirates really did, the truth, not just the Hollywood stuff. And I was planning on writing some just fun fiction, kind of in the mold of old Raphael Sabatini novels, and I'd done lots of research. And one thing I realized very quickly was similarities between a lot of the things we did as a Navy SEAL and a lot of the tactics from the 17th and 18th century of various sea rovers, pirates, privateers, etc. And there was no book on the subject, so I ended up writing the book because I had all this information, had a good perspective on it. And it's kind of write the book, the old rule about, write the book you want to read. And it's just basically a tableau of the real tactics that these people use. And now I'm going to pass this over to Mike because he can probably tell you from a gaming aspect, which is not quite reality. Who was the philosopher that said that the map is not the territory. The game has to, you can try to make it as accurate as you want, but it's never going to be a completely accurate emulation of reality. Plus, you want the game to be fun. You actually want people to play it. So,
sure.
Mike.
Yeah. So just to run off what you said there. One of the things, for example, is you have one of the places we can't quite match the reality from a game perspective because it's just that wouldn't be fun. Is and I brought this up somewhere else recently, but like you read a lot of the accounts of the battles that took place, right? And it's these guys weren't super interested in really running up to each other with swords and hacking each other to death. That wasn't something anybody wanted to do. So there's a lot of gunplay, right? More so than anything else, especially for within the period itself. I think there's more of an emphasis on just musketry than anything, even in militias and such. But as a result, because these are 17th century smoothbore muskets, you've got battles where there's like 300 people on each side, and one side takes 4 or 5 casualties, and that's enough. They're out of there. They're packing it up and heading home. So that's something that would not make a fun game. If it's it's like, oh well, I lost one guy out of my 50, so I'm out of here. That's it. That's game over. So but we do try to go back to the point. So when the things just to try to, I think it's easier for me to work with examples here, right? So one of the big examples is the way that we create stats, right? So a lot of historical games don't really have stats, right? Because the reality is that a guy with a musket is a guy with a musket, and there might be the exceptionally good guy with a musket, but in general, there's not a lot of difference between an average regular human being with a musket, aside from maybe their level of training, right? So one of the ways but it's one of the staples of non-historical wargaming in general, is just that people like for creating flavor and such, and that adds a lot of fun to the game, is stats, right? So this guy shoots and hits on this number, he saves on this number, his morale is this, that kind of thing. So we do add that in the game, and we put it in there. But a lot of times, what we'll do is where let's say a character's shoot stat. Let's so in general, right? We put the French units in general tend to shoot better than the others. That's not so much an actual reality of better marksmanship, although maybe that argument could maybe be made. But it's more along the lines of that's the way they fought in a lot of cases, right? They had a heavy emphasis on musketry, especially in sea battles and such, where they emphasize musketry over artillery from a privateer standpoint anyway. So as a result, we give them a better musketry skill. It encourages the player to basically use them in that way, so that they end up playing historically, because you're going to lean into the strengths of your faction. So you end up doing more musketry than maybe with artillery when you're playing a French privateer list, because you're getting that bonus, right? And the rules make it so in other ways where we do things like if you're shooting at a section, we have a rule called fatigue. It's a mechanic called fatigue, where as your units take hits and as they push themselves to try to get more actions done, they'll start accumulating fatigue, and then that fatigue will eventually slow them down and prevent them from doing things. So you can shoot up a unit on another ship that's manning the cannons, right, and essentially get them to a point where they're suppressed, and which we call shaken. And when they're shaken, they can't take action. So you can actually effectively prevent a unit from shooting their cannons at you by just suppressing them heavily with musket fire, which is an actual historical tactic, and it just plays out in the game pretty simply without having to add a bunch of stuff. And that's a sort of thinking that we apply to everything, as far as trying to get the historical flavor and the tactics that would happen in period into the game.
Interesting. So some of what you do has to do with balancing stats so that you can encourage players to play historically and give some different play styles per faction. But you also mentioned that you were interested in getting cultural information outside of just how battles panned out. So how have other aspects of the history of piracy, of the culture around it, made their way into this game?
The biggest thing that jumps out right away is the resolve value every unit has, which is the resolve value is basically their morale, and it's just how willing they are to fight, essentially. So again, that resolve mechanic ties in directly to the fatigue mechanic I just talked about. So whenever you're hit in combat, whenever you try to take a rally action, you're always rolling that resolve stat to try to prevent fatigue from accumulating. So a lot of times, like for example, some of the pirate, a lot of the not pirates, but a lot of the Buccaneer factions, right? The Buccaneer factions are not really super motivated to all just run in and get killed for the sake of victory, but they're also not really cowards either. They're not gonna, the second bullets start flying, they're not shaking in their boots necessarily. So they're right in the middle. So in that aspect, that's because of their motivations for fighting. They're kind of just stand in the middle as far as the resolve goes. They can take hits pretty well. They're not super. They're not quick to run, but they're not exactly super stalwart or resilient either. On the other side of that, you have the pirates that we're working on now for the Kickstarter that we just finished, which moves our guys into the 18th century, and in there you get the later generation of pirates who aren't really motivated to fight. They're trying to get in. It's like what Benerson talked about. These are the guys, if they run into the British Navy, they're running or they're just getting slaughtered, right? Because they're not really interested in a fight. They want plunder, but they don't want to. They just want to intimidate you and get you to not fight and surrender. So as a result, if they do get caught up in a fight, which they did occasionally, they're not very motivated to stay fighting. So once they start taking hits, their resolve will start falling apart pretty quick, and they'll start accumulating fatigue quickly if you don't have a good commander to help you take advantage and clear it all out. Does that answer your question okay, I think?
Yeah, and I have a follow-on for Benerson, which is, so, Benerson, you have had, it sounds like, quite an influence on the development of this game and of the look of the game. What are you trying to communicate in terms of pirate culture and appearance and tactical style through the game that somebody might not otherwise pick up?
There's several different aspects of that. one of the primary areas is the look of the figures themselves and the look of the vessels. I know Mike was on board immediately. It's one of the first things they said was that they wanted to be historically accurate. And popular culture has a big misconception of what pirates looked at. As a matter of fact, I'll pick on Mike for a second when he said shaking in their boots. That's a common expression. These guys didn't run around wearing bucket boots. There were no horses on ships. People didn't wear these things, but yet everybody has this idea, this 19th century to early 20th century version from Howard Pyle and all these painters, that this is how these guys looked. Now, you could take a look at, let's say, a French or an English buccaneer from the late 17th century and recognize them immediately. But you would also notice that they're not quite dressed exactly the way you think that they would be either. They had this very swashbuckling panache, very kind of maritime, gentleman of fortune kind of look, but it's still a little bit different. And so, foremost, they got the figures right. Actually, it turns out a couple of scholars had probably run across these in past decades, but had never actually recognized their significance or commented on them. And I ran across in the French National Archives. Thankfully, they've been digitizing everything. There were some 2 or 3 French engineers who were surveying all the French ports in the Caribbean, and in the cartouches of these charts that they were drawing, they would put these incredibly detailed eyewitness images of the Buccaneers, the hunters who often sailed with the Buccaneers, and the French Buccaneers as well. And we use those to base the figures. We had written descriptions, but those are always subject to interpretation. But here we are, it's probably 15, 16 different figures, and we know exactly what they look like. So that was one of the big areas, is just exactly what these guys look like and what they should look like, and make it accurate. I haven't heard anybody objecting really much or saying, hey, why don't they have big, bucket boots, and why don't they look like Johnny Depp? I know there is a category of game player who likes that stuff, but Mike can tell you better, but I haven't really seen anybody complaining about it. They actually appreciate the historical aspect. But also, Mike, go ahead, Mike.
No, I was going to say, nobody really complains, but it is something that is often requested.
Yeah, it's, and female Buccaneers and pirates is another big request. I think I see Mike get hit up a lot on some of the Facebook posts and things. And we tried to, and that's another, cultural line that you're treading carefully on. There were if you please don't bother look at the Wikipedia page on women pirates. It changes almost daily. And it's 50% incorrect, and it's often trolled. There really weren't that many that we know about in the late 17th, early 18th century. Matter of fact, you could really only pick 2. There were a couple women charged with piracy, but it was more of a comical escapade than anything else. There's Anne Bonny and Mary Read. There were probably some in disguise, but that's about it. But all of these other, Jacques de la Haye and all these, they were fictional pirates, 20th century creations.
But hey, you could do a Madame Ching expansion.
Mm-hmm. They are doing I know Mike's doing the Buccaneers at some point, there are some references to the wives of some of the French filibusters, Buccaneers in the 1670s, 1680s, as being as good as shots and things as their husbands. And they may have gone on some of the smaller scale raids. We don't know for sure, but that in itself is enough to, get you right in there to create at least a small faction.
It's a stretch, but it's enough
in there.
Yeah, it's a stretch, but it's enough for us to say, yeah, why not? We could do that.
Yeah.
Because we want to be as inclusive as possible too, but we also want to be true to the history. So
yeah, there are players that I know that want entire female crews. It's not historical, but play the game how you want to play and have fun with it.
Yeah.
So is this game scenario based? Are there campaigns that you can play, goals for different factions, or is it more of a free for all?
Yeah, so the game is completely scenario based. You don't have to play a scenario if you don't want to, but the rule book has 5 basic scenarios, and then there's 5 more in our expansion book, and there's a couple others floating around out there that we've released. Some non-historical ones, like we released a Halloween scenario that's got some haunted stuff and things like that. And then as far as campaigns, there is a campaign system. When it comes to miniatures games and playing campaigns, it could be a little tricky because anybody who's played in a miniatures game campaign knows that there's always a lot of excitement up front. Everybody always is excited. They build their crews, they get everything ready. And then 2-3 sessions in, it kind of dies out. People get busy. They're not able to commit to a weekly, monthly, whatever game, and it gets, especially with all the additional record keeping and stuff involved with the campaign. So we made ours. We shot to make it as simple as possible, to make it as playable as possible. There's not a lot of stuff to keep track of. Primarily, what it is, and again, it stems the inspiration comes from history, and particularly what it is you play you're playing a commander. It's almost like an RPG aspect to the campaign. So you have this commander that you're building up, and he or she starts off as a no name, person trying to build their way up. And you could start out. You could maybe put together you could recruit a small crew for an expedition. You could maybe get yourself a piragua or a pair of canoes or something to go out and raid. But that's the best you could do. Now, as you gain influence and experience, you're able to but you're able to recruit larger crews. You're able to get larger vessels, things like that. Which all, if you can look at the historical example of like Henry Morgan, for example, right? Not super clear where his origins are, aside from the fact that he's Welsh. But he basically comes to the Caribbean as a no-name. Probably comes along with the Pen and Venables expedition, and then is a captain. Eventually works his way to become a captain under Christopher Mings, who's raiding the Spanish, probably one of the first kind of hybrid Navy Buccaneer commanders, and eventually just gains prominence, gains influence and respect, and eventually is able, when he makes a call out for recruitment, I mean, every Buccaneer in the Caribbean comes out to answer that call, and eventually he's able to put together an army of thousands of Buccaneers to invade Panama. So that's kind of the idea, is you're working your way up to becoming a Henry Morgan of sorts. So that's how the campaign system works.
Nice. So I'm assuming that each of the scenarios requires a bit of historical research and has a lot of touches. Benerson, have you written any of the scenarios yourself, or?
I've provided Mike a lot of information on some of the historical information on the scenarios, and usually I try to break it down into, this is the history, and here's some suggestions that you might want to look at for the game. But Mike is a real expert in that area. He basically will run down through the history and say, okay, we can take this, and make it work. It's been really useful sometimes from my research as well, because it's made me look in even more detail at some of the scenarios I already knew well, and just gives me a chance to go back and look at it. One of the virtues I've had in doing historical consulting, and especially for Firelock games and also for Black Sails to a degree, is it makes me question what I actually know. And a lot of times, as I tell Mike, I've found a lot of things I'm going to end up using in books, following questions he's answered, and I wanted to get more detail into it. But basically, I provide pretty much the history, the real history for the scenario, and then Mike will kind of carve that down and pick and choose what he needs to out of there to make it referential for the game.
Are any of the scenarios just straight up based on real world events and actual scenarios that happened?
Yeah, so that's actually I kind of forgot to bring that up. So we have a couple scenarios on the website in our download section that are historical encounters. We have I forgot what we called them, but it's basically when the Spanish privateer Blas Miguel he attacks a town in Haiti trying to basically avenge his brother. And then fails miserably. And then there's when Francois Lolonais, who's one of our crazy French privateer or Buccaneers, when the Spaniards try to ambush and capture him, and he turns the tables on them. We have that scenario there. But one of the big things that Benerson has helped with a lot, and one of the scenario things I left out, and it's also kind of a campaign system built into it, is the Buccaneers Companion, which was written by a contributor of ours named Nate Zettel. And he basically got so there's a really famous Buccaneer expedition to the South Seas, right, which is the the Pacific coast of South America, and there's William Dampier and all these characters like Bartholomew Sharp and a bunch of other guys, and Basil Ringrose and all, like a bunch of guys kept journals and such on this. So it's really, really well documented. So he went and got that whole voyage and made scenarios out of each major conflict, and then Benerson provided all the history for it, and we tied it together. And that's actually like our organized play kit, and that's on our community section on our website. But so that's another type of the scenarios that we do as well that are separate. But the ones in the actual rule books are sort of flavored historically, but those are very much more inclined into gameplay, so that it's not just kind of a static stand around, shoot each other kind of game. It just gives you things to move for. So there's a lot of the objectives are kind of abstracted. They're just points on the field that you have to kind of move up to take, just to represent gaining ground and pushing the enemy back, and breakthroughs and raids where you've got objectives to defend and attack, that kind of thing, So it's not they're loosely historical, but they're really more gameplay focused.
Gotcha. What is the quirkiest or funniest thing that you've learned about pirates on this journey that made it into the game?
Oh, quirkiest or funny? That's
Or are your scenarios all very serious?
The scenarios are. I don't know if I'd say that they're very serious because it's still a game, but but they do tend to be competitive in nature or historical in nature. The exception being our hunting scenario, which has basically haunted objectives that will attack you if you go near them, which is always fun. And it's designed to be multiplayer as well, so it's like a bunch of different groups vying to try to get past the ghosts to get the treasure or whatever, that kind of thing. So that, as far as the scenario goes, that way. But we've got some fun stuff in the actual rules for some factions. Like some of the more piratically inclined factions have the ability, or I don't know so much if it's the ability, but potentially can begin the games in a drunken state, where they are perhaps a little more bold, but not as skillful, due to being inebriated. And then we have the Logwood Cutters, which are essentially like they're tree poachers, right? And these guys are not all, but a lot of them are former Buccaneers, privateers, pretty rough and tough kind of guys. And the Spanish see them as interlopers and invaders. So they're constantly being attacked, but they're also constantly attacking the Spanish and carrying out acts of piracy. So they're when you play them, if they're defending, they're in a state. They could be caught in various states. So they could be drunk, they could be unprepared with unloaded weapons, that kind of thing. So they've got some random stuff that can happen with them. We have a Native American commander for the Carib faction, and we just have an account that was kind of humorous to some degree, though also kind of horrible and brutal. But he's basically trying to tell these people that he's their friends, and then and then he kills a child and and is shooting at them, but he's like, no, we're friends, come out, so that kind of thing. So he's got rules to kind of to reflect that. So he can try to trick your guys into coming out and not shooting at them.
History is so wholesome.
Yes.
Yeah, that's one area that because it's a game, it's. I know Mike's. Nobody's going to be on board with pirates were basically slave raiders. That wasn't their primary occupation, but they were constantly enslaving people. Prisoner, even free people of color were often enslaved and things. And so there's areas of history that you tiptoe around, or it's because it's a game. It's like watching going to Disneyland or Disney World and going on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. I enjoy that ride. It's a lot of fun, but I know Mike and I both know the real history behind it, but that's probably not what we're thinking about it. Thinking, Disney's lying about history. It's, we understand it's been reinterpreted, for fun. And so even though I know the game has a lot of emphasis on history and it's broadly multicultural, and I suppose you could really, play it that way if you wanted. Native American defenders, you're not coming, you ugly Buccaneers, to take us as slaves. We're going to kill you all on the beach or something. You could always play it like that, and I'd probably enjoy playing that aspect. As a matter of fact, Mike knows I'm very sympathetic to Spain and the Americas. In spite of the negative things they did, they've been portrayed many times in an even darker way than they were. And frankly, if I were a Spaniard in Campeche or something, and Buccaneers came in and sacked my town and assaulted my wife and kids and all these things, I'd be out on the water chasing every Buccaneer down and, trying to string them up from the yard arm as often as I could, which is another aspect you can play from on the game. And it's another reason I enjoy it.
Right.
So what are your boundaries in terms of what you're willing to include, what you cut out, and what you make optional when you're dealing with something that did have its less savory elements, such as piracy?
So a lot of the stuff, like specifically things like the excessively brutal things that are just not okay to play around with in general these days, like slavery, for example. There's just no reason to include it. and there's no, it doesn't add anything to the game, it doesn't do anything. So typically, if there's no real reason to add it, aside from the fact that, well, it happened and we need to cover it, that certain things we don't need to cover. We can just leave those things aside. We don't have to cover it. It doesn't affect the game in any way. It doesn't have a significant impact. There may be things that influence it, right? So, like for example, we give a lot of the Africans, a lot of the African units in the game. This goes kind of back to the old cultural question. Um, they typically have higher. They have sort of a mixed morale value because they're they're on the poorer end because they're, even though they're not that they're not brave fighters, but they don't want to. They know that if they're captured, they're going to be enslaved, almost for certain. So as a result, they're likely to flee to escape that potential reality. So it does kind of play into the game a little bit, but there's no need to go and talk about that necessarily again and make it that like, oh, this guy got captured, he's a slave now. We don't need to do that. we can just go right past that.
And this is you see this regularly for the last century almost in fiction and film associated with piracy. Black Sails is a prime example. Early on in the season, we had a lot of discussions with this. You actually see, the pirates having a conversation, that we're really no different than the English merchants we don't like because we're taking and selling slaves too. But to keep that show going, you had to build a narrative arc that basically they make an alliance with escaped slaves. To do anything, I think fictional game, film, or anything, you're not going to win a huge audience by depicting these guys as accurately as they actually were, because there are a lot of the dark side to it as well. So this is common in fiction and everything. We tend to sanitize things a little bit and pick the elements out that we like. And for me, maybe it's because I can compartmentalize. I don't have a problem with that. Like I said, I enjoy the Disney ride. I enjoy this game, but at the same time, I'm well aware of the history behind it as well. Now that said, there's a lot of nonfiction out there that follows that same path down there, primarily I think for marketing, and that they're not really going to go after the truth at all.
Right. Yeah, and there's probably something to be said for the opportunity to educate on that history, right, in a proper setting. But I don't think a game is necessarily the way to do that.
And yet, I do think the game is educational to a large degree. It is very multicultural. It's introducing players to, hey, there was a lot more going on in the Caribbean than what you've read,
right.
What you've seen in movies and read in, novels and even read in a lot of history books, or popular history books about piracy. I mean, right there, the game is just vast. I mean, you can literally, you can be almost anybody in the Americas you want, because there's no place in the Americas untouched by piracy to some degree. So, I mean, if you lived on the coast, there's sea raiders and sea raiding going on. And I know the game's expanding into other areas as well. Some of the northeastern Native Americans and, where you don't even have to touch on the sea. Although, nice historical point, there were a fair number of Native Americans in captured European vessels who went raiding and looting up and down the coast and engaging in, plundering warfare as well. Nice little known historical fact.
Interesting. As you'll talk about the game, I've noticed some sensitivity about what terms you use. So pirate and privateer, I talked about in my history class. Y'all seem to be using Buccaneer in a different way. And I know that you also have factions from various nationalities. So what kinds of different people can you play in this game? We've talked about it a little bit, but what's a more wide-ranging explanation of who you can play and what they can do and what that means?
So I can answer the bit about what kind of factions. I'll go into the way that works in the game, and then I can let Benerson jump in and talk about the differences between a privateer, a buccaneer, and a pirate, etc. So within the game, we have several umbrella groups that we refer to as nationalities, which works in some cases, not really in others, but works as a catch-all term for the game. So you have the English, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and then you've got the Native Americans, and you've got the unaligned and peripheral. So that's so you have those 6 main umbrellas, right? And under each of those, there's a whole bunch of different factions. So, for example, within the Spanish, you can play various groups. So you have the Spanish militias. You have various Spanish militias of different types. You've got the Spanish Armada de Barlovento, which is their navy forces in that region. You've got the tercios, which are the regular army units for the Spanish in the New World. You've got the corsarios, who are the kind of the the more elite privateers that come from Europe, particularly from the Bay of Biscay region. You've got the guardacostas, who are the localized privateers, right? That are kind of a little more makeshift and ragtag. And that's just some of them, right? There's tons that you could do from each. So we have a total. I think our total right now, I always forget the exact number, but I know it's in the 60s. I think it's 67 different factions between all of them, right? And then and they'll each play a little different based on what that faction's objectives were, what their motivations were, the type of units that make up those factions. They each get some special rules and things like that. So, and I'll let Benerson illustrate the difference on what some of these different things could mean, basically.
Okay, I'll look real quick just at the basic terms of buccaneer or filibuster or flibustier, privateer, and pirate. These are kind of a combination of legal and technical terms. Okay, a pirate basically is anybody who is plundering illegally at sea. Basically, it's robbery nowadays it's robbery on the high seas. 17th, 18th century, basically it's any waterborne robbery, armed robbery at sea. You could even charge people with doing it on rivers, coastal waters, etc. So if you're a thief at sea, you're a pirate, period. If the government has given you a license to plunder enemy shipping, you're a privateer. Okay, that means and some people say privateer is just lawful piracy. It's kind of yes and no on that. Basically, you're a paramilitary arm of navies at the time, in which you're essentially attacking the enemy's commerce. You have a broader term sometimes that you'll see called a cruiser or a seeker, and that is a privateer or a legitimate man of war, a naval ship that is engaged in commerce raiding, that is, on attacking enemy merchantmen to profit from it and to diminish enemy trade capacity. Buccaneers and the flibustiers are kind of a quasi version of the pirate and the privateer. When they grew up in, let's just take 1655 with the capture of Jamaica by the English from the Spanish as a good starting point. The English and French governments use these paramilitary raiders basically as some of their defense in the Caribbean, and also as a method of damaging Spanish strength in the Caribbean. Essentially, they said, yeah, go plunder and we'll turn the other eye. Sometimes they had legitimate commissions to do that, in which case they were technically also privateers. Sometimes they had false or bad commissions, or no commission at all, but the government's kind of winked at them and said, yeah, don't worry about it, we won't prosecute you. But starting with the English in the 1670s, mid to late 1670s, and well into the 1680s, English government quit backing the Buccaneers, in which case most of them turned legitimate pirates. And there's a lot of this sounds like quibbling, but there's a lot of scholarly arguments that are, trying to say Buccaneers weren't really pirates because a lot of the things the Buccaneers did don't fit with their ideological scholarly arguments. So they're trying to cut them out. And for advertising and marketing, everybody likes the word pirate. So this is a quibble, but it just annoys me repeatedly. I've even heard this on NPR. It was if it weren't for English pirates, we might have the metric system. And I even emailed them about that, didn't get a reply back. It was legitimate English privateers who attacked the vessel. It was all legitimate. They weren't pirates, but everybody tends to use the word pirate as a substitute for privateer because, who knows what a privateer is, and pirate is sexy. I even had some of the subtitles on 2 or 3 of my books. I was forced into, publishers always retain the rights to actually retitle your books, just for anybody out there who doesn't know that. And they've used the word pirate in as opposed to a broader or better term because, pirate's sexy, Pirate tactics sounds better than the tactics of sea rovers or pirates, privateers, and naval commerce raiders. It's shorter and everybody leaps on it. But anyway, those are your basic distinctions right there. If the law doesn't say you can do it, you're a pirate.
So far in our conversation, y'all have mentioned some expansions to the game. So right now it's set in the Caribbean. You have 17th and 18th century pirates. But how broadly could this game ultimately expand? And what are your plans for that?
Good question. So we have a lot of plans for that. So primarily our focus has always been to keep the theater to the Americas, right? So pretty much anything from North America to South America. And right now, with the way things sit, we cover the vast majority of that. There's a couple little missing spots, like we don't cover anything involving anything basically really far north, like Inuits, the Pacific coast from basically from basically the western half of the United States up to Canada is kind of a little bit. We've got stuff you could use for it, but it's not quite filled in the way I'd like it to be. But other than that, we cover pretty much everything to one degree or another across the rest of the continents here. So that's where we sit right now, and the time frame goes roughly for what's covered presently from about 1600 to 1700. So now we're working our way into, with our Kickstarter we just did, we're working our way into the early 18th century, so going up to about 730, 740. And our plan is to basically, one of our big things here at Firelock is to really make games, these types of games, particularly historical games, have a little more mass appeal, right? You'll hear a lot of guys in the historical gaming community talking about the graying of the hobby and such. So we try to actively address that by making the game appealing. So we approach the game in the way a fantasy or science fiction world would, right, where they have a story that's progressing. So we're doing the same thing. We're moving the timeline forward slowly, release by release. So our next big ones will cover, that the rest of that 17th century, pretty much up to the American Revolution, and cut it off there. And then from there we'll go to the American Revolution period, the Haitian Revolution, a bunch of stuff like that. And then from there you go to jump up to the 19th century, the War of 1812, even a little bit before that, the Quasi-War with France, different, the Barbary Coast Wars, where America takes takes violence across the seas for the first time, really. So things like that, So we have a pretty broad range. And then from there, I mean, the cool thing is that we've, the game continues to grow and the community continues to expand. So as long as that keeps happening, we could potentially expand. From there, we could start expanding overseas. We could start covering, particularly in the pirate rounds of the 1690s in the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, all that region, Southeast Asia. There's so much interesting, cool stuff there. We could just, sky's the limit on how far we can take it.
So basically, you'll go on forever as long as there's interest and appetite for it.
Precisely, yeah.
I can respect that. However, that does mean that there's a lot of material out for this game already, and also in the future. If somebody wanted to start playing Blood and Plunder, where do you start? What do you get? What do you look for?
Very good question, yeah. So the first thing you're going to want, obviously, is a rule book. So we have 3 versions of that, and they're all the same rules. It's just 3 different ways to get them. So we've got a PDF version, we've got the regular print rulebook hardcover, and then we've got a fancy deluxe version that's got like a leatherette cover, and it's a really, really beautiful book. And that one also has our first expansion in with it. So it's a big, thick volume of tons and tons of stuff. Pretty much covers the full 17th century gamut. So you're going to need a rulebook. You're going to need a pair of poker decks, just regular playing card decks, right? We sell specialized decks that have all the game information printed on them, but regular card decks will work. You need a handful of 10-sided dice. Some D6s are good to mark various statuses on units. And then you need some models and some playing surface. If you don't have a big terrain collection or anything like that, or are intimidated by making one, the game works from a bird's eye view perspective, so you could totally do 2-dimensional terrain stuff, literally just cut out different pieces of felt or whatever, and that'll work fine. Or if you are more navally inclined, you could just get a pair of ships to go with your force. We have a full range of ships that we sell. So a pair of ships, and then you don't need any terrain at all. Just a blue tablecloth will suffice as a seascape. And then makes the game very accessible, very easy to get into. We also set it up so that the games play on a small space. Living in Miami is a very expensive city, so a lot of people who live here don't have very large homes, so we don't have space to set up a big, 8-foot by 4-foot table. So the games are designed to play on smaller spaces, 3-foot by 3-foot boards, 4-foot by 4-foot boards, that kind of thing. So that's the best place to start. On our website, we actually have 2-player starter kits that come with a rule book, 2 decks of cards, 2 small forces, some dice, and pretty much everything you need to jump right in. And And we've also got starter bundles, so which gives you like army boxes and a ship that you can bundle up with that and an activation deck and stuff. So we've got plenty of resources to get started on our website, and you can just jump on there and see what strikes your fancy.
All right. And Benerson, question for you. If somebody wants to get started reading about piracy, where do they start?
You want me to plug my own books, or
That
you want
is
me to
permitted,
plug someone
sir.
else's? Okay.
Always plug your own books.
Yeah. I'll weasel out of plugging other books right now because there are so many good ones out there, and that's actually a fact. There's a lot of good books on the subject of piracy out there. For my own, it really depends on what you're interested in. The Sea Rovers practice that Mike mentioned, if you want to know at all what the real tactics were, everything from how to chase it, how a pirate would chase the enemy to actually engage it, fight it at sea, ashore, whatever, that's Sea Rovers practice. If you're looking into pirate myths, look at the Golden Age of Piracy, because basically all I do in that book is break down a lot of the major myths and show their origins and show why they're incorrect, and also hopefully why the truth is far more interesting than the myth. I'm in fact working on a book on that subject right now, basically just going to go back and show the development of modern pirate culture, you might say, going back to the original writers in the 17th century. And two or three other books out. The only other one I would mention is Pirate Hunting. If you really want a history of piracy from antiquity to the present, but looked at from the point of view of its victims and the people who went out after pirates, that's probably a good book to read. It's an unusual perspective that hasn't been touched on much by most pirate authors. It's always rah pirates. As a matter of fact, if you want a best-selling book on pirates, go for the myth. Back the myth up, tell the myth. Don't come out and say, "Yeah, Blackbeard, he's just a thug with a big beard," that kind of thing.
What?
doesn't play quite as well.
Yeah.
Hey, the guy lost the only fight that we have documented that he was actually in. He got beaten badly.
How dare you?
as I made happen in True 1 week, because that his last battle is actually the big theme of our new 2-player starter set that we just released on our Kickstarter with all plastic models and stuff, which is a great way to get started in the game actually, but you have to wait till next year to get it. But we did a live stream with my buddy Rufus here, and he played Robert Maynard and I played Blackbeard, and he slaughtered me just like it happened in real life, unfortunately. So it held true.
Frivolous question before I ask where we can find you on the internet. What is the very best pirate movie?
Oh, I have to get the very best pirate movie. If you mean historically accurate, forget it. The best will probably not even hit 50%. My favorite is probably Captain Blood with Errol Flynn, which is, it's just classic, romance based on the Sabatini novel. I'm trying to think if there's any other really, really. I have a lot of fond associations with a lot of these old films, but that's probably what I would pick. There's just historical accuracy is just not out there in pirate films. I don't know. Mike's probably got his own favorites.
Yeah, so I don't know. That's a hard question actually. I think I have to actually say, just because there's never been a pirate movie that has really scratched the itch of what I'm looking for in a pirate movie. So as a result, the pirate movies I enjoy most tend to be a little bit lighthearted. And as a result, I probably have to say Yellowbeard is my favorite pirate movie. I think of all the pirate movies I've watched, I've definitely gotten the most enjoyment out of Yellowbeard. Yes. So.
Yeah, I will make a plug for another book. Now that Mike's brought it up, that's not only a really good, real fun movie, but George MacDonald Fraser wrote a book called The Pirates, and I think it's Pyrates. I've got it right up on the shelf above me. It's kind of like a Yellowbeard send-up. Fraser wrote the Flashman series and all these. He died a few years ago. But if you want to read something, with a comic twist and somebody who really appreciated the subject, read that book. And like Mike said, Yellowbeard, I would agree with that. That's got to be definitely up there, one of the top 3 or 5 on my list.
Yeah, such an underappreciated movie too. It just nobody knows about that movie unless you're like a pirate fan. If fan is a loose word, but yes, it's definitely an interesting film. If you haven't seen it, check it out.
All right, I will.
Don't watch it with your kids.
Duly noted.
Yeah. Monty Python, Cheech and Chong. Okay, you
Yeah.
get the idea.
Yeah.
So, Mike, where can we find you on the internet?
So the best place to find what I'm working on the internet is firelockgames.com. That's FIRELOCK. So firelockgames.com. That's where we have all of our good stuff. We are very active on Facebook as well. We talk with our community very often and are always really engaged on. And there's a Facebook group called Buccaneering Across the Spanish Main. Blood and Plunder, Buccaneering Across the Spanish Main. There's also the Oak and Iron gamer group for our Oak and Iron game, and the Blood and Valor player group for that game as well. Which, if I can, I'd like to plug Oak and Iron as well. So if you're interested, because I know, Liz, we talked briefly before we started recording, that you have not actually played a miniature war game because the painting and such intimidates you. If you're finding this conversation interesting and want to get in, but maybe you're intimidated by a traditional war game, definitely check out Oak and Iron. It's the second game we put out, and it's kind of all packaged. One box has everything you need to play, including ships where the hulls are brown, the sails are white, so you don't really need to paint them, and it still looks good. You got a play mat in there with a seascape, terrain, rulers, dice, rule book, cards, everything you need, all in one package. So, and it's $69. Be sure to check that out if you're interested in that. I know that's the one Benerson gets on the table occasionally.
Yeah, and I have a daughter. One of my adult daughters was a tall ship sailor for a number of years and wants to get back into it. She loves playing it with me, so that's, we lay it out on the table and we just blaze away at each other for an hour, and she usually wins. So
fantastic. And Benerson, where can we find you in the vast sea of the internet?
BenersonLittle.com is my standard website, but BenersonLittle.blog is probably far more interesting. People seem to. I try to write a blog as often as I can on various swashbuckling piratical subjects. Some serious, some not serious, but that's probably going to be more interesting. And if you need to get in touch with me, you can get in touch with me through either one of those sites easily. And I'm also on Facebook.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both so much for your time. It has been really interesting not only to hear about a miniatures game, but also to learn some stuff about pirates.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Happy gaming, everyone.